I've been trying to watch one new movie every week, or at the very least, every 2 weeks. And I realized that on my personalized Netflix list, I had 3 Western films. And it kind of hit me. I've never had 3 Western films that I've been wanting to watch at one time. And I know that doesn't sound like the biggest of deals, but the reason why I found it very interesting is because we all know Westerns are not as big as they used to be. So one of the Westerns I had on my list was The Power of the Dog, which is a recent film and is starring Benedict Cumberbatch, Kirsten Dunst, Jesse Plemons, and Cody Smith-McPhee. The second Western I had on my list, which is a Western I am surprised I never got around to watching, even though over the past 15 years I know is a Western I've wanted to watch, and considering Christian Bale is my favorite actor of all time, this movie is the one movie of his I have never seen. I'm pretty sure it's the only movie he's ever done that I've never seen until last night, which was the remake 3:10 to Yuma. And that obviously stars Christian Bale and Russell Crowe. And the third Western I've wanted to watch, I haven't seen it yet, but it is a newer release, is The Harder They Fall. And this one stars Idris Elba, Zazie Beetz, Regina King, Jonathan Majors, and countless others. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because as I'm looking at my list, I'm thinking to myself, that's a lot of Westerns. I have experience watching tons of Westerns in my life. My grandfather was massively into Westerns. It was his favorite genre. As a kid, I always remember sitting on the couch watching them with him, enjoying them as well. But they slowly started to die out come the 70s of cinema. And my question here is, how long is it going to take for the same thing to happen to superhero films? Superhero films, in my opinion, are the Westerns of our modern day cinema. They are dominating the market the way Westerns did in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and a bit of the 70s. Back in the 40s and 50s, from 1945 to 1955, there were about 50 Westerns a year, whether that be on TV or in cinema. 50 Westerns a year. Let that number sit in. 50 Westerns a year for 10 years. But once the 60s came around, Westerns started to slow down a little bit, and they weren't in cinemas as frequent as they were before. Also, too, I do believe Westerns started to take more of a TV approach than they were doing cinema. A little representation of that fact is actually Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino with Leonardo DiCaprio, Margot Robbie, and Brad Pitt. Once you got to the 70s, and of course this is going to happen with all different types of generations and societies and trends and ways of belief, Westerns started to slowly diminish because cinema started to get a little grittier. And it started to get a little bit darker, and films started to have different tones and atmospheres to them. Also, too, Westerns were pretty simple in the sense of you have good and you have bad. Good has to beat bad. Unfortunately, sometimes bad will beat the good. But once you started to hit the newer generation of the 70s and 80s, they started playing around with the morality of good and bad. Just because you are bad, are you bad to be bad? Are you chaotic? Bad? Are you neutrally bad, lawfully bad? And they started to play around with those tones a little bit more, and I don't think Westerns were fitting that bill. Now, before I dive a little bit more into this conversation, because it's mainly a discussion, I want to point 2 things out. Number 1, Westerns are not dead. They truly aren't. They still make a decent amount of Westerns every couple of years, and some Westerns are still very, very good and even hold up to the Westerns they made back in the day. And number 2, this, like I said, is simply a discussion. I don't have the answers for you. I don't know, truthfully, no one knows, but I don't know if superhero films will follow the same downfall Westerns did. It could not. Look how successful superhero films tend to be nowadays. It almost feels like there's no stopping them. Every single superhero movie that hits theaters seems to have a billion-dollar box office every single time. When movies are putting up numbers that way, and when you're getting this many people to go to the theater to watch a superhero movie, it does make you question, like, are they really getting fatigued? Or are they honestly just ramping up even more? I mean, there's a couple of ways you got to look at superhero films too. Mainly, they started coming around in the 60s, especially with Adam West's Batman. You know, you had the time of Christopher Reeve's Superman. You've had the time of Michael Keaton's Batman. Superhero films wanted to be sprinkled over here for a couple of years. Then, you know, maybe 3-4 years passes and more superhero films over here for the next 2 or 3 years. Then they'd hit a huge gap in between that, maybe 5 to 6 years. Oh no, you know, here you go again. More superhero films kind of painted over here. But now, when you look at superhero films, we get, 3 or 4 a year? And the majority of that is obviously coming from Marvel, and especially too, because Marvel is doing something that no studio has ever done. They essentially said, why don't we just take what we do in the comic books with a massively connected universe and put that into live action? And they have geniusly, thanks to Kevin Feige, found a way to do that, and it works. So obviously, when something so unique and prestigious and exciting like that happens, you're obviously going to get the attention of the vast majority of people who are thinking to themselves, this is awesome. And I think the reason why Westerns were so interesting is because that was a lot of the mythology of people's lives. People back then 100% may have had parents who were just getting out of those cowboy days, or they've had grandparents who were cowboys. I mean, it's crazy to think how much we have digitally and technologically advanced in 50 years. When I was watching Power of the Dog, that movie takes place in 1925. And when you look at their way of life, you can't tell the difference between 1825 and 1925. Not even 50 years later, they were already advancing in technology so vast that 1925 seemed like thousands of years ago. We aren't even fully 100 years past 1925 yet. We still got 3 years to go. And those days seem so far away. Like, they don't even seem like it's our history. It's someone else's history. So I think back then, cowboy films, westerns, spaghetti westerns, they were so deep rooted into people's lives that I think there had to have been a connection where people thought to themselves, look, I didn't live through this. I've never experienced something the way they have like this. But my parents might have kind of lived through this situation. Or my parents' parents, my grandparents, I had a grandfather who was a cowboy. There had to have been some sort of connection like that for Westerns. Maybe there are completely other reasons why Westerns were so successful during the time they were. And if you have explanations of that, put it down in the comments. I would love to know. But I'm just saying that probably has to be one of the explanations, and a pretty big one too. Now, like I said, the times are changing. They've changed vastly. And trends change even quicker than the times change. Whereas maybe at one point every 10 years, this was in, and this was in, and this was in. Nowadays, it almost feels like every year there is a brand new trend you have to hop on. And I did make mention that the whole Western world was a mythology for a lot of people back in the 50s, 60s, and a bit of the 70s, also the 40s and earlier. I think it's more appropriate to say that superheroes may actually be more westernized culture nowadays. When you look at Greek mythology, which still stands tall to this day, there still is a pretty big interest in even that, and that's thousands of years ago. But you think of the gods like Zeus and Aphrodites and Hades and Ares and Medusa. And I do wonder that if some of the hardcore mythology that the Western side of the world, Americans and Canadians, like what we will kind of be known for in our mythology is superheroes. In a lot of ways, when you do look at DC and Marvel and the content they have created for nearly 100 years, it does feel very mythological. I mean, especially I'm going to be centered more on the DC side, of course. You basically have gods in the Justice League. That is essentially what they are. Superman's a god, Wonder Woman's a god, Flash is a god, Green Lantern, Aquaman, and some of them are literally kings and queens. Aquaman's a king, Wonder Woman's a queen. You even have Batman, who in a lot of different instances is literally written to be a human god, somebody who is human, who is mortal, but his stature through writing and his history has just been changed, where he is so phenomenally unique that he almost feels like a god. There have even been instances in comic books where he's obviously gained powers and has been a god for a small amount of time. And I can't help but wonder if people will look back at our time and think to themselves, superhero films were so rampant during this generation. Maybe our mythology comes from superheroes. I can't really think of another westernized cultural mythology that stands kind of the stature of Greek gods or Roman gods the way superheroes can stand as gods in a sense for Western mythology. And like I said, there's no answer. This is simply an opinion. This is simply a discussion. I don't really know what is eventually going to happen to superhero films. If history chooses to repeat itself, which it often does, it will eventually slow down. Now, I think to myself, though, in my opinion, I don't think there will ever be an end to the MCU, or I don't think I will ever live long enough to see the end of the MCU. I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe is something that they want to continue. I mean, look at Star Wars. The Star Wars saga doesn't just reboot itself and start from the beginning. It just continues a story that George Lucas simply had in the 70s. I think that might work the same way with the MCU. The storyline will just keep going. Someone might be living in the year 2122, 100 years from now, and they will have an endless list of Marvel films that all started from 2008's Iron Man, and it is still following one entire story this past 100 years. I wouldn't be surprised if these companies and these studios want to keep a legacy like that. But the question now is, how often are we going to get superhero films? How much longer can we go year after year of 3, 4 superhero films a year? We know how long these movies take. There's a lot of attention to detail. The CGI, there's a lot going on in these films. Their budgets are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It takes a while to craft the right story to keep the worlds expanding and growing. But the fact that they can still make 3 of that a year is pretty wild, and including TV shows. So it just feels like there's no end. When are we going to get back to the point where maybe it's only 1 movie a year? Or maybe it's 1 movie every 2 or 3 years, and they're still following one concurrent story, but it's not as often as it used to be. Is there a possibility that maybe we do hit a drought, and then maybe 10, 15, 20 years after that drought, it starts becoming popular again, and they start doing 3, 4 movies a year? It's just a very interesting thing to think about, because nowadays, of course, superhero films are so grand in every way. You almost can't meet a person who hasn't seen these movies or at least some of these movies. 90 to 95% of the population knows what a superhero is and has watched superhero films. I mean, what would I do without Batman? I need a Batman movie at least every couple of years. But I can't see this just lasting forever. There has to come a point where people are going to get a little bit tired and they do want a break. Especially too, you think to yourself, when Avengers Endgame came out, that was a spectacle on its own. That was 10, 11 years in the making. People have been waiting for that moment of the final war against Thanos since 2008. So when you finish something so big like that, something so jaw-dropping when it comes to production and just the simple fact that they were capable of executing something like that. Something only you would think you could imagine in comic book form, not something you'd think you'd ever see in live action adaptations. But you need to keep the audience interested. You still need to grab people's attention. And where do you go after something so big and epic like that? How do you beat that? And that's why Kevin Feige, I believe, is going down that multiversal route, because that is something that is just so interesting on its own. And just the simple fact that you're gonna see people who have played certain characters from years ago in brand new MCU movies and taking those people and involving them in an MCU is a lot of fun. Does there come a point where the storylines are just getting far too epic and far too exciting that you have nothing to combat your past idea? I do believe there has to come a point where things are going to slow down. I mean, you look at Westerns nowadays, and some Westerns are really, really good. Some are okay. But when you look at Western films, no one sits here and jaw drops over them anymore. We have had a history of Western films, and even though Western films will never stop being made, it's just not enough to grasp people's attention to be like, I need more of it. And I do think to myself that the same thing is going to happen to superheroes. And I'm not saying that it will never come back around again and be as popular as it is now, but it will probably happen eventually. When will that happen? I have no idea. I just think it eventually will. And I know we can all sit here about DC and Marvel because Marvel is not perfect by any means. And we can sit here and talk about, well, this movie didn't need to be made and this movie didn't need to be made and blah, blah, blah. But as long as the overall picture is interesting, people, I don't see this drought happening anytime soon. I mean, that's pretty much all I got for this one, guys. I just thought it was a very interesting topic. I did want to talk about it. Once again, it's a discussion. There is no true answer here. And I want to know if you all feel the same way, that maybe superheroes will follow the same trends of the Westerns. And also, too, if you do agree that maybe DC and Marvel and that world of heroes are kind of the westernized culture and mythology. But anyways, everyone, that is it for this video. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it made you theorize as much as it made me theorize. So until next time, everyone, I will talk to you all very soon.